On May 14th, 1948, Israel is reborn. The ashes of the Holocaust still smolder as the Jewish people celebrate a homeland and a country of their own after 2,000 years of exile, persecution, and captivity. Yet the question remains, are the Jewish people the legitimate heirs of this land?
Get out of your country, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Lift your eyes now, and look from the place where you are. Northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever.
Israel, 12,000 square miles of land that lie at the epicenter of a world conflict, just less than 1% of the world's landmass. A modern country haunted by ancient lies and questions of legitimacy. Accused of being occupiers and thieves, Israel clearly stands precariously against a growing worldwide hatred. What is not clear, is there a solution to the puzzle called peace in the Middle East? An integral part of the world's media campaign to destroy the Jewish state is to discredit and erase ancient Jewish history, a history that dates back over 4,000 years to Abraham and the Davidic kingdom of Israel. Over the centuries, Israel was conquered and ruled by a succession of superpower empires: Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Christian Crusaders, the Ottomans, and the British. However, only one sovereign nation ever stood here: Israel. Now, after 2,000 years, and against all odds, Israel stands here once again.
The Jewish people, the most hated people on the planet Earth, the only people to experience multiple exiles and dispersion, to be scattered around the world, to lose their national homeland, which, by the way, for a good chunk of human history was arguably the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet Earth because of its geographic location especially. You know, we should have, by all normal laws of history, been this layer cake in the land of Israel of extinct civilizations, bye-bye Jews, hello Philistines and Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Umayyads, Fatimids, Ayyubids, Mamluks, Seljuks, Ottomans, British, and bye-bye Jews. But the Jewish people were promised that they would survive and that they would return to their land. And the reality is, in the last century, we see a truly singularly unique event in human history.
In 1936, when asked to identify the basis of the Jewish claim, David Ben-Gurion replied, "The Bible is our mandate. But how can a book that many claim to be just a collection of myths and ancient legends support Israel's rights to the land? Even if the Bible supports evidence for an ancient Israel, does it support the modern state? What historical texts outside the Bible give evidence for Israel? Are the many archaeological discoveries that support Israel and the biblical narrative merely Jewish propaganda? Do the international treaties, declarations, and resolutions that created the Jewish state and many of today's Middle Eastern countries still hold a legal basis for Israel's existence?
There are two strains of people. There are people who would be Zionistic and pro-Israel and who would have made something like Exodus. And Spielberg is like a split personality because his heart is doing that. But then there's other people like Tony Kushner, who wrote the Munich script, who are profoundly ambivalent about the existence of Israel. They say, oh, the Holocaust was bad, but Israel wasn't the response. That's what is really in their heads. They will give sort of like pseudo-leftist justification of this, that, oh, they pushed out the poor Arabs and stuff like that, without obviously going back to the history, which there was no Islam when 2 Jewish temples were built in Jerusalem. Anyone with even this much knowledge of history knows that. And those people know it too, but they won't look. It's a willful blindness.
In order to verify the Jewish people's right to the land, the many aspects of the biblical, archaeological, historical, and legal evidence must be examined. Knowledge is power, and only through examining such proof does it become clear that Israel truly is indivisible. Many of the aspects of biblical, archaeological, and historical evidence for the state of Israel invariably cross over and support each other. As discoveries are made by archaeologists, both biblical and historical texts are proven, and a new light is shed on the ancient information. More and more discoveries are made each year that prove the Bible to be not only a holy text, but a true historical book of amazing and miraculous events. Much like archaeology, historical writings outside the Bible also provide a valuable link between Israel's past and present. Undoubtedly, the greatest foundation for the Jewish people's right to the land lies in the Bible. The Bible has at least 170 references to the land of Canaan. 55 times it speaks of the land as an unconditional covenant to the Jews, confirming the gift with an oath. 12 of those times God stated that the covenant was everlasting. Yet many today believe this book to be just another collection of myths passed down through the generations. But are they? And what is myth? In his letter to an unbelieving C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, wrote,
"All the other myths of the world are a mixture of truth and error. Truth because they are written by those made by and for God. Error because they are written by those alienated by God. But the Bible is one true myth. It is a true accounting of truth, while everything else we do is mimicking."
The Smithsonian Department of Anthropology recently said this about the Bible. Much of the Bible, in particular the historical books of the Old Testament, are as accurate historical documents as any that we have from antiquity, and are in fact more accurate than many of the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or Greek histories. These biblical records can be and are used as are other ancient documents in archaeological work. For the most part, historical events described took place, and the peoples cited really existed. The Bible is essentially a religious history book. It is a book about God and his relationship with Israel and the Jewish people. It is a book written to Israel, for Israel, and about Israel. Biblical Jewish history began approximately 4,000 years ago in the land of Ur with the patriarch Abraham.
If you read through the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, which predates the scriptures of any other contemporary faith, you will find in the narrative of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the biblical statement that God promised this land to these fathers for their seed forever and ever.
And it's clear from the promise that land is part of it. That promise was eternal, and that promise really impacts all of civilization, all of mankind. Even though the promise was made to Abraham and his descendants, yet God in the midst of that promise also says all the nations of the world will be blessed through Abraham. So the question is, how does that work? How does God talk to one man and one family and therefore one people, and have that message be relevant to everybody in the world?
Hebron is home to the world's most ancient Jewish holy site, the Cave of Machpelah, the tomb of the patriarchs. The cave, along with the trees and field adjoining it, was purchased by Abraham as a burial place for his wife Sarah some 3,700 years ago. This is the first recorded transaction of a Hebrew buying land in Canaan. The patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Rebekah, and Leah, were all later buried here. The building covering the cave was constructed by King Herod over 2,000 years ago.
Hebron is the cradle of Jewish history. Everything starts here. Hebron means connection. From here, Abraham connected the whole world to one God, because this land has this power of connecting, this energy, special energy in this land. From Abraham came Isaac, from Isaac came Jacob, and only from Jacob, that his name is Israel, was changed from Jacob to Israel, came the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel.
Only in a world of archaeology do rocks speak. And in Israel, the rocks tell much of a Jewish presence in Israel for over 3,000 years.
I mean, that's the best stuff. The facts on the ground that you can dig out of the ground show overwhelmingly the continuous Jewish presence in the land of Israel. And contrary to what some people like to say, especially the Arab detractors who claim there never was a Jewish presence in the land, the exact opposite is true. The more we dig, the more we find. And what people don't appreciate is that, you know, Israel is one giant archaeological site. Of what could be dug up in the land of Israel, I would say 98% remains unexcavated. To make assumptions or statements about what archaeology does or doesn't prove about the Bible based on information that hasn't been turned up, as we say in legalese, lack of evidence is no evidence of lack.
After the First World War, the new British Mandate territory of Palestine was the setting of an archaeological renaissance. Israel became a treasure trove of archaeological discoveries, with the biblical narrative finding proof with greater frequency. With the conquest of the land by Joshua, the prophecy to Abraham saw fulfillment. Under the judges, the Jewish people began to organize and unite in the first kingdom called Israel. David and his son Solomon created and led a powerful and united Jewish country in the land till 924 BC. Solomon's death resulted in a split that led to a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel stood for over 200 years until its invasion and destruction by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom of Judah stood for over 400 years. In 589 BC, the Babylonians conquered Judah and destroyed the first temple. Although the Jewish people will rebuild and rise again in the land, the zenith that had been obtained by Solomon would not return until modern times. Beyond the Bible, many other ancient and historical texts, from Egypt to Iran, point to a land and kingdom called Israel. In 1896, in an Egyptian temple in the ancient city of Thebes, an archaeologist discovered the stele of Merneptah, an ancient poetic eulogy. This find dates back to around 1250 BC. Of significance to biblical studies is a short section at the end of the poem describing a campaign to Canaan by Pharaoh Merneptah. Presently, this is the earliest known mention of Israel outside the Bible and the only mention of Israel in Egyptian records. It reads, "Israel is desolated. His seed is not." This indicates that at this time, at least some constituent of Israel had agricultural and stores of grain. For almost 4 centuries, Shiloh was the religious and administrative capital of the Israelite nation. As the center of Israelite worship, the city is mentioned in the Bible in both Judges and in the book of Joshua.
And the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there.
In under 40 years, Joshua leads the people into the country, crosses the Jordan River, starts to conquer the land, does part of conquering the land, and brings all the people here, right here, to this spot that is where ancient Shiloh was situated. And I'm talking to you about 3,300 years ago. And they set up the tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle mentioned in the 5 books of Moses was a portable tabernacle, a temple that could be taken apart and put back together like Lego, only it was made of acacia wooden and gold-plated, with the Ark of the Covenant and the altar and the menorah, the candelabra. And that was brought from place to place. But when they entered the land of Israel, on the one hand, they knew from prophecy that eventually there was going to be this city that will be the city that God will choose, that will be the eternal capital.
Archaeologists recently discovered holes carved into the ground in Shiloh, which could have held the beams of the tabernacle, which housed the ark. The city of David is the original hilltop upon which King David dedicated ancient Jerusalem as his capital 3,000 years ago. One cannot talk about the biblical evidence for Israel without looking at Jerusalem. In the Bible, it is mentioned 667 times. Jerusalem has been a Jewish holy city since the days of King David and is holy to both Judaism and Christianity.
Well, another one of the myths of the Middle East, the Arabs have been so skilled at putting these forward, is that Jerusalem is their third holiest site in Islam. And we've just accepted this as a tenet. In fact, you'll see it repeated over and over again in Associated Press stories, New York Times stories. We've just accepted the fact that Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam. Well, where is the evidence to support that? We can go back to the Quran. Is Jerusalem mentioned in the Quran? No, not at all.
The Jewish people are the indigenous population, and any document and any piece of evidence that you can find anywhere makes that very, very clear. Even Arab references, everywhere, all the time. They're now hiding them. But I have the tourist guide from the Supreme Muslim Council from 1930 talking about the Temple Mount. And it says this is like a prehistoric site. This is the site beyond any dispute. This is the site of where David built an altar unto God and offerings were offered and the temple was built there. And they're totally emphatic about it, the early Muslim names for this site. Only in 2000, Second Intifada, did it all disappear.
I'm dumbstruck by the brazenness, of the kind of propaganda they put out that Jews never inhabited the Middle East, and the Temple of Solomon wasn't the Temple of Solomon, and just on, just rewrite history.
When you fight a clash of civilization, when you fight a religious war, the effort to distort the past, to distort history, to distort the truth, to distort religion are as important as long-range missiles in the current war. Therefore, the temple, according to the Palestinians, never stood on Temple Mount. The Israel kingdom never was here. King David wasn't here. Everything started with the Muslim and will end with the Muslim. All the rest is not history, not existent.
Deep under the dirt and rock, the city of David has revealed some of the most exciting archaeological finds of the ancient world. Recent discoveries there include a collection of almost 50 clay ceilings or boulets with Hebrew lettering. They bear dozens of Hebrew names, 2 of which belong to persons named in the Bible. Also discovered deep under the nearby Temple Mount, a large cistern that could hold 66,000 gallons of water. It dates back to the era of King Solomon and may have been used for bathing and drinking by pilgrims coming to the Temple Mount.
Here we are standing in the city of David, outside the walls of the old city. But in fact, this little hill outside the walls of the old city is Jerusalem from the Bible. When we want to understand where's the proof of the Jewish people in this land, going back 2,000 years, 630 years before Islam was even invented, here I hold a coin in my hand which I carry with me every day. This coin says on it, it was minted by Rome 27 times, it says Judea capta. Jews or Judah is captured. 2,000 years ago, my people, the Jewish people, we had already been living in this land for 1,100 years. This had been our home for over a millennia. Today, when we come back to this land, we're simply picking up this exact same journey and beginning from where we left off. We're back in Zion, the Jewish people are back home. And in fact, if we want to understand how we are indigenous people, who are the indigenous people? 2,000 years, my ancestors were forced out of their homes by the Romans. And today, here we are back. And this is the proof that I carry with me every day, lest I should forget that my ancestors just a short time ago were fighting for what I'm fighting for.
Not far from the city of David stands Mount Moriah. This was the site of the temple. In 515 BC, King Herod transformed the Second Temple into an edifice of splendor and surrounded the Temple Mount on its 4 sides with massive retaining walls. The Temple Mount, the buildings, and the temple itself were completely destroyed by the Roman legions in 70 AD. The lower part of the Temple Mount walls were left standing. Best known of the remaining is the traditional Jewish prayer area of the Western Wall, called the Wailing Wall. It has stood exposed above ground level for 2,000 years now. When the Israeli forces won Jerusalem back in the defensive Six-Day War, the wall symbolized the return of the Jewish people to their holiest site. Abraham Duvdevani was one of the first paratroopers to reach the wall that day.
I looked to the right and stopped dead. There was the wall in all its grandeur and glory. I had never seen it before, but it was an old friend, impossible to mistake. Then I thought that I should not be there, because the wall belongs in the world of dreams and legends, and I am real. I went down and approached the wall and stretched out my hand towards the huge hewn stones, but my hand was afraid to touch it. There will be no more destruction, and the wall will never again be deserted. It was taken with young Jewish blood, and the worth of the blood is eternity.
On the very eve of Israel's independence, an amazing discovery was made in a long, untouched cave on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The treasure consisted of a collection of 972 texts that were named the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a rare example of archaeological and historical evidence. The scrolls include the oldest known surviving documents that confirm the reliability of the Old Testament. The Golan Heights have revealed an amazing number of archaeological finds, some over 3,000 years old. Jewish life flourished there until the mid-8th century.
In antiquity, this was part of the Galil, and there was no difference and there was no border between the Galilee and what today is being called the Golan Heights. Therefore, in archaeology, we find exactly the same synagogues, the same population, the same culture that we find on both sides. And like we find in the Galilee, hundreds of Jewish villages were found and excavated. About 40 synagogues were found and excavated. Evidence that matches the documentation, the written documentation we have from historical writings of the time. In the Golan, till 1968, no one knew almost nothing about it because the Syrians were not interested in any scientific research. And since 1968, lots of research is being done.
Israel gained control of the Golan in the Six-Day War, and much of the world now sides with Syria in calling Israel occupiers of this piece of real estate. For many years, the Syrians used this high ground to launch missile, artillery, and sniper attacks against the Jewish people below. Inhabited from 200 BC, Gamla was one of the few Jewish cities in the Golan to stand against Vespasian's legions. At the time of the revolt, the town minted its own coins, bearing the inscription, "For the redemption of Jerusalem, the Holy." No doubt they were produced to make a political statement to the Jews, and possibly to the Romans. It shows that even under the most difficult conditions, the people of Gamla still remembered the original aims of the revolt, symbolized by the redemption of Holy Jerusalem.
Gamla was the capital city of the Golan during Second Temple period. It was the biggest city. It was built as a Jewish city by Alexander Jannaeus in the beginning of the 1st century BCE. It is well known from the rabbinic literature and from the historical literature as well, like Josephus, for example.
Several historical text sources outside of the Bible give evidence to the state of Israel. The historical books of Josephus, a 1st century Jewish historian, give the greatest account and understanding of ancient Israel outside of the Bible. As a Jewish military leader in Galilee, he fought the Romans in the First Jewish-Roman War. After his capture, he was granted Roman citizenship and accommodation in conquered Judea. His most important works were The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews. The Jewish War recounts the First Jewish-Roman War and provides crucial information about the Roman siege and conquest of Gamla, where some 4,000 inhabitants were slaughtered.
Not a soul escaped save 2 women, for at that moment the rage of the Romans was such that they spared not even infants. but time after time snatched up numbers of them and slung them from the citadel. Thus, on the 23rd of the month was Gamla taken. Flavius Josephus.
One of the most preserved archaeological sites in the Golan is the ancient village of Katzrin.
Katzrin is one of the examples of a Jewish village that was found and excavated in the Golan. And in the center of a Jewish village, of course, stands the synagogue. This was the center of the Jewish life in those days. And when we're talking about a village from what we call in Jewish history the Talmudic period or the Byzantine period in the general history. And of course the question raised, how do we know this is a synagogue? How do we know this is a Jewish village? The answer to that has to do with a couple of archaeological findings that were found over there. One is a cemetery with tombstones, with inscriptions, all of them in Hebrew. And maybe the most interesting symbol that we find in these villages to prove the fact that this was something that has to do with Jewish origin is the menorah, the 7-candle menorah, which was taken from the temple to Rome. We know that from Titus' Arch.
Israel's historic and legal claims to the Golan are unique and irrefutable, with the archaeological evidence further cementing Jewish rights. Located on the shores of the Dead Sea, Masada was built on top of an isolated rock plateau. Herod the Great built palaces for himself on the mountain and fortified Masada between 37 and 31 BC. Masada was identified in 1842 and over the years was extensively excavated. Due to the remoteness from human habitation and its arid environment, the site remained largely untouched by humans or nature for over 2,000 years. After the destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish rebels fled Jerusalem and settled on the mountaintop. In 73 AD, the Romans laid siege to Masada. The Roman legions surrounded the mountain and built a rampart wall and a siege ramp against the western face of the plateau. After 3 months, the walls of the fortress were breached. According to Josephus, when Roman troops entered the fortress, they discovered that its 960 Jewish rebels and their families had set all the buildings ablaze and committed mass suicide. Josephus recounted a stirring speech by the Jewish leader.
Let our wives die before they are abused, and our children before they have tasted of slavery. And after we have slain them, let us bestow that glorious benefit upon one another mutually, and preserve ourselves in freedom as an excellent funeral monument for us. And let us spare nothing but our provisions, for they will be a testimonial when we are dead, that we were not subdued for want of necessaries, but that according to our original resolution, we have preferred death before slavery.
Only 2 women and 5 children were found alive. By 200 BC, the Jews had succeeded once again in creating an independent kingdom, covering much of the biblical land of Israel. But in 63 BC, Jewish authority in the land came to an end when Roman General Pompey captured Jerusalem. The land was renamed Judea and absorbed into the Roman Empire. The spark for freedom burned within the Jews, who began to revolt against their Roman masters. The First Jewish-Roman War began in 66 AD and culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. During the siege, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and most of Jerusalem. Josephus wrote extensively on the battle for Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple.
Jerusalem was taken in the 2nd year of Vespasian's reign. Titus had taken the city 1,179 years after King David. He ordered the entire city and the temple smashed to the ground, leaving only the tallest of the towers standing and part of the western wall to show posterity the strong defenses which had yielded to the Romans.
Evidence to this can also be seen in the Ark of Titus, built to commemorate his Judean victory. It shows the triumphal parade of Roman soldiers with the temple vessels carried aloft. In 135 AD, the Jews launched another rebellion, the Bar Kokhba revolt. As each before it, the uprising could not defeat the world's only superpower.
Archaeologists and historians now believe that it took all or part of 14 Roman legions were needed to crush Bar Kokhba, which is unbelievable because the Romans only had 24 legions in the whole empire. When that revolt was finished, the Romans were so fed up with the manpower and material losses the Jewish people had caused them, they decided to basically get rid of the Jewish people. And they figured that those Jews that had survived, and I actually believe that statistically far higher percentage of Jews died between 67 and 135 than died in the Holocaust. I believe that, forget Europe where 70% of the Jews of Europe were killed, I think that about 60 to 70% of the Jews in the world were killed out in that period of time. So the surviving Jewish population in the land of Israel, the Romans decided, we've had it with you guys. So what they did was basically decide the best way to get rid of a people, besides to continue to persecute them, was we're going to cut them off from their country. So they renamed the country from Judea, they said let's give it a non-Jewish name, to Philistia, named after the extinct Philistines. But it's amazing because their agenda was to do exactly what is going on today. Cut the people off from the land by creating an alternative identity and connecting the land with that identity. Exactly like there are no Philistines alive today, okay? They've long since disappeared. So they renamed the land, instead of Judea, Philistia, after the extinct Philistines. They renamed all the cities in Israel. But it was the whole thing was done deliberately to cut the Jewish people off from their country in the hopes that this annoying people who never seemed to go away would finally disappear.
The name change reflected a Roman policy, first pagan, then Christian, to alienate Jews from the land, ensuring that no Jewish temple, no Jerusalem, or Jewish state ever rose again.
The fact that the covenant was unconditional did not mean that the Jews would always be faithful. They were severely chastised. And yet over and over again in the Old Testament, God always says, I'll scatter you, but I will bring you back.
Modern historians have come to view the revolt as being of decisive historic importance, with the massive destruction and loss of life leading to the Jewish diaspora. The majority of the Jewish population was either killed, exiled, or sold into slavery, and Jewish religious and political authority was brutally suppressed. Yet still many remained and maintained a Jewish presence there. The war and the aftermath were also chronicled by Roman historians Cassius Dio in his Roman History and Aelius Spartaneus in the Augustan History.
I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that you will soon utterly perish from the land, and the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number, among the nations where the Lord will drive you.
Hundreds of years earlier, the book of Deuteronomy prophesied the Jewish exile and diaspora. Was it punishment for Israel's sins, for abandoning God? Was it God's divine wrath? Or was it an opportunity for a renewal of faith in God? An opportunity to be a light unto the nations and to inspire others? Was the exile an opportunity to strengthen the Jewish people, a means for searching and finding God in order to spread godliness?
There are three, they call it curses or punishments. We have to know that punishment by the Almighty means correction. It's like a father who punishes his son, means I want you to be better. He puts him into a situation that makes him better. There are three things that Israel experienced. One, the land will be desolate. That's why no nation wanted to come here. It was a protection. Second, we will go to the diaspora. Israel will spread it all over the world, go to the diaspora in order to protect, so nobody can destroy the people of Israel. And the third one is that will be anti-Semitism. The moment will be we start to feel comfortable and start to assimilate. They will say, you Jew, remember, you are a Jew. So they will mention all the time that we are Jews, so we will remember. 3, desolate land, nobody wants to come to Israel. Second will be anti-Semitism to remind us that we are Jews, when we will feel comfortable out of Israel. And the third one will be spread all over, that nobody can destroy the heart of the world, the Jewish people.
For over 2,000 years, the diaspora found most of the world's Jews living in exile and persecution, a people without a land, The non-Jewish world looked with suspicion upon this people set apart. In every country, the Jew became the convenient enemy. As Christianity broke away from Judaism and became a dominant religion, the Jews became the Christ killers, as some clergy held that the Jewish people were collectively responsible for killing Jesus.
Many people believe that the church is going to replace Israel as the position in the earth. I absolutely 100% unequivocally do not believe that. I do not believe it's Bible-based. Anybody that believes that is misguided, misinformed, don't know their Bible. We have the Presbyterian Church, and even now the Methodist Church is leaning in that direction. Again, I would say that, you know, God does have a plan for the church, and it's not to replace Israel. Israel is God's chosen people. They have always been God's people, and they will remain so even until the very end. God will see them through.
During the Middle Ages in Europe, there was a full-scale persecution in many places, with blood libels, expulsions, forced conversions, and massacres. Jews were banned from owning land and from pursuing a variety of professions. Persecution in Spain and Portugal led a large number of Jews there to convert to Christianity. However, many still secretly practiced Jewish rituals. The Church responded by creating the Inquisition, often brutally torturing Jewish suspects. In 1516, the Republic of Venice decreed that Jews would only be allowed to reside in a walled-in area of town called the ghetto. The requirement for Jews to live in ghettos spread across Europe. Living conditions were horrendous, and Jews lived as prisoners at the mercy of the surrounding town. The ghettos also provided a convenient target for violent mob attacks called pogroms.
This is the only place where Jews can live freely and where we can defend ourselves by ourselves. And we don't have to give too many historical examples what happens to us when we don't have our land.
Men who needed scapegoats for their own failures turned readily against the Jew. Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia faced constant pogroms and persecution. The Tsar's chief advisor was reported as saying that 1/3 of Russia's Jews were expected to immigrate, 1/3 to accept baptism, and 1/3 to starve. In 1894, the Dreyfus Affair erupted in France and profoundly shocked emancipated Jews. The depth of anti-Semitism in the first country to grant Jews equal rights led many to question their future in Europe. A Jewish journalist, Theodor Herzl, described the affair as a personal turning point. He argued that the creation of a Jewish state would enable the Jews to join the family of nations and escape anti-Semitism. Herzl infused Zionism with a new political urgency. In 1903, the Tsarist secret police began combining earlier anti-Semitic documents into a new publication, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols stated the menace of Zionism, the goal, uniting all the Jews of the whole world in one union, a union to dominate the world.
This book purports to be the words of psychopathic Jewish world leaders that are conspiring to enslave the entire world.
The Tsarists, who were anti-Semites to a fault, engineered the fabrication of a document they call the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for the purpose of sustaining one of the grounds for hating the Jews and engaging in pogroms against them, namely that they ran the world. And it is an extraordinary piece of work, not only because of the use that the Tsarists and those in Russia made of it, but the application of it to this very day by people who continue to find it useful for discrediting or undermining or justifying assaults against the Jews.
If you read some of the documents of the Nazis and newspapers of the Nazis and so on, you will see that they consider the protocols, Hitler himself considered protocols to be a historical evidence for their anti-Semitic fantasies.
Judaism gave us the rule of law, comes out of the Sinai,
And it's one of the reasons, I think, that anti-Semitism is always one of the first refuges of the scoundrels. They need to undermine that idea that the law is above the ruler. And one way they do that is to go after Jews and Judaism.
Still, there were those who sympathized with the Jews. A deep-seated philosophical and religious movement grew, Christian Zionism. While camped in Palestine, Napoleon issued a proclamation promising to restore Palestine to the Jews. The idea soon took root in British soil. Notable British advocates included John Nelson Darby, Lord Shaftesbury, Lord Palmerston, George Eliot, Holman Hunt, Sir Charles Warren, Hall Caine, Sir George Gawler, British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour, and Lord Lindsay, who wrote in 1847,
"The soil of Palestine still enjoys a Sabbath, and only waits for the return of her banished children and the application of industry commensurate with her agricultural capabilities, to burst once more into universal luxuriance and be all that she ever was in the days of Solomon."
Lord Shaftesbury was the most active restoration lobbyist. He never had a shadow of a doubt that the Jews were to return to their own land. It was his daily prayer, his daily hope. "Oh, pray for the peace of Jerusalem," were the words engraved on the ring he always wore on his right hand. At the time, there was no hint of Arab nationalism, and the population of all of what might be considered Palestine, Transjordan, and Lebanon probably did not exceed 300,000. More than 10,000 Jews lived throughout what is today Israel, and that number grew exponentially as extreme anti-Semitism rose in Europe and Russia. Sir George Gawler, a hero of Waterloo, urged the restoration of the Jews as the remedy for the desolation of Palestine.
"I should be truly rejoiced to see in Palestine a strong guard of Jews, established in flourishing agricultural settlements and ready to hold their own upon the mountains of Israel against all aggressors. I can wish for nothing more glorious in this life than to have my share in helping them do so."
God says in Leviticus, when I kick you out, this land is going to feel it and show it. This land became a desolate wasteland, so desolate, he says in Leviticus, that no other nation will be able to live in it. And then he says in Deuteronomy 29, it's going to be so desolate that I'm going to send men of foreign tongues to come and testify. In 1500, 1600, 1740, I found a letter that the French council actually counts the number of people in each city, and it was a minuscule amount. Mark Twain has a whole section in one of the books in which he describes this empty, cursed, barren land, quotes Deuteronomy 29, Mark Twain, and doesn't realize that he's the fulfillment of the prophecy that I'm going to send men of foreign tongues to come and testify.
A desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds. A silent, mournful expanse. A desolation. We never saw a human being on the whole route. Hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. Even the olive tree and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country.
The war to end all wars promised to bring the dawn of a new order, a progressive and modern 20th century, a democratic world safe for all peoples, even the Jewish people. Jews looked on in hope as President Wilson promised a world made safe for democracy. But as economic problems grew, many once again focused their resentment on the convenient enemy, the Jews. One man promised the rescue of Germany, a cleansing of the cancerous species.
This is foreign correspondent Seabrook Peters of the Berlin Bureau reporting to the New York Times office in New York City. Here in Berlin, it is 9:30 a.m., November 10th, 1938. I have just spent 8.5 horrendous hours following Nazi stormtroopers on what probably will turn out to be the worst pogrom in Western history. I have just come from the Versammlungsstraße, where one of the most revered synagogues in Germany is totally engulfed in flames. The fire was started by the Nazis shortly before dawn. Jewish men have been murdered and Jewish women raped. As the leading German rabbi, Dr. Leo Beck, has just said to me on the phone, after this, the future is grim. We have no place to go.
No country wanted them. Even the countries in which they were citizens would not protect them. Their crime? They were Jews. More than 1/3 of the Jewish people were murdered.
Hitler had been murdering Jews right and left. I saw it, and I dream about it even to this day. The Jews needed some place where they could go. It was my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives.
Through it all, the Jews remained a people with a longing for the return to Zion, an integral part of the life of every Jew. This longing was not exclusively European, but also a part of the Jews living throughout the Middle East. Following the Arab conquest of the Middle East, hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Arab world managed to survive the onslaught. Although they were tolerated, they were never afforded any level of equality of rights. The long history of Muslim persecution against Jews and Christians took its inspiration from the Quran. Even though the Jews lost political control of their land, they never abandoned it physically, nor did they renounce their claim to the nation, the only continuous claim that exists. Jews managed to remain in varying numbers physically at all times on the land. The big lie is that the Jews returned after 2,000 years of separation, where they found crowds of indigenous Palestinian Arabs. The fact, the Jews are the indigenous people who have continuously stayed on their holy land.
People think that the Jews are some sort of foreign entity that came here in waves of immigration from Europe escaping from the Nazis. But the truth of the matter is that we have a solid majority throughout almost all of history uninterrupted. It was only for a few hundred years during the Islamic conquest of Israel that the Jewish population dwindled to almost to very, very low. But even then, they weren't able to completely excise the Jewish population from here. And we're the only nation in the history of the nations that has had a continuous presence here, and most of the time have been the majority here. And again, anytime that we haven't been the majority here, it's because we were forcibly expelled from the country by the Romans and then later by the Muslims.
The Jewish presence in the Holy Land persisted throughout its bloody history. Many believed that the long-sought Jewish national homeland was finally brought into being by a horrified, conscience-stricken world, a refuge for Jews who had become victims of the Nazis. So it is perceived that Israel is composed of the intruding offspring of European survivors of Nazi brutality. In actuality, Israel's present population consists of refugees and their descendants from two oppressions, Nazi and Arab. As anti-Semitism and the harsh mistreatment of the Jews increased in Europe, the Muslims' own Nazi-like bursts of brutality and banishment of Jews in the Arab world increased. This triggered a massive exodus of hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing from Arab persecution into Israel.
And there were pogroms by Muslims against Jews who lived in Arab countries. The most notable one is what is called the Farhud, which was the pogrom against Iraqi Jews in Baghdad, 1941, where 150 Jews were killed by the Iraqi Arabs. This was just one example, but there were other pogroms against the Jewish people in Syria or Lebanon or in Libya or in other places in the Maghreb. And many of them were either thrown out or many had to leave without anything, just their shirts on their backs.
By 1947, multiple communities with over 630,000 Jews inhabited the land.
We have Jews from Africa, from Australia, from more than 90 nations that have come back. We have nearly every language on the face of the earth. So we have them from all the nations in the world, exactly as God says. I will bring them back from all the countries where I've scattered them, and they shall dwell in the land.
The Jews come here from all over the world, come from all over the lands that they were not allowed to own land in. Right? They weren't farmers. They didn't know how to pick up a pitchfork. And suddenly the land begins to blossom, the desert begins to bloom. That's because God is speaking to the mountains. Ezekiel 36, mountains, shoot forth your branches, give forth your fruit, because my children are coming home, which means every tree you see in the land of Israel is prophecy fulfilled. Every blade of grass, every fruit you have for breakfast. If you've ever had fruit in this country and marveled at how good it tastes, it's because you're not eating fruit. You're eating prophecy fulfilled. If you understand that, you understand this whole country.
The proof that the Bible supports an ancient country called Israel is undeniable. But does it also support the modern state? Several scriptures prophesy the return of the exiles, the rebirth of the nation, and the resurgence of the land.
If we take all of these verses of Scripture together, both Old and New Testament, it is very clear that God made promises to Israel that He intends to keep, and He will keep those promises, and they will be fulfilled to the end.
The most striking and prophetic is Isaiah's verse, foreshadowing a nation born in a day.
Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion labored, she brought forth her children.
Isaiah describes a woman giving birth before going into labor and birthing a country. On the day the Jews declared independence, the United States issued a statement recognizing Israel's sovereignty. And only hours beforehand, a United Nations mandate expired, ending British control of the land. During a 24-hour span, foreign control of the land of Israel had formally ceased. Israel declared its independence, and its independence was acknowledged by other nations. Modern Israel was literally born in a single day. But no matter how many verses prove an ancient or modern Israel, few in our modern secular world accept the Bible as a legal document. However, on a legal level, there are many other treaties and documents that, though conveniently ignored by pundits and leaders, do exist and give international legitimacy to Israel's existence. They have not expired and are still in full force and effect.
This right that the Jews have to the land of Israel is founded not only in historical rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, that we are the only people who ever had a sovereign state here, ever, but also in international law.
On November 2nd, 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, made his landmark Balfour Declaration.
His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
November 11th, 1918. The Great War comes to an end. This first global war would reshape and affect world stability to this day. In the end, the Allied nations defeated the Central nations of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. April 25th, 1920, delegations from the triumphant nations meet in San Remo, Italy, to divide the conquered Turkish Empire. That historical meeting transformed the Middle East, and, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the world's nations called for the reestablishment of a Jewish homeland in the area called Palestine. Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, that granted the League the authority to create nations out of areas conquered in war. Britain received the mandate for Palestine and Iraq, while France gained control of Syria and Lebanon.
The San Remo Resolution gave the Jewish people this homeland. They called it the British Mandate, and the mandate actually charged the British government with establishing this as a Jewish homeland. The rest of the Middle East was carved up for the Arabs. So if you go back to international law, you can go back to the 1920 San Remo Resolution and see that it ratified the right of the Jewish people to establish their homeland in Israel.
France, Italy, and Japan sat on the San Remo Supreme Council, along with the U.S. and Britain, approving the San Remo decision. It was further approved by the 52 members of the League of Nations. This resolution became a binding international treaty and effectively answered a fundamental issue that still plagues the peace talks today. Is Israel an occupying power, or does it have a rightful claim to the land?
The war in the Middle East is not about land. The whole Palestinian case is a monster lie. There isn't an inch of Israel on Arab land. It was all controlled, owned, lock, stock, and barrel by the Turks, who aren't Arabs, for 400 years. And they lost the First World War. 5 countries were created out of the ruins of the Turkish Empire: Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Israel. You know, nobody's accusing the Syrians or the Lebanese or the Jordanians of stealing the land, only the Jews.
The 1920 San Remo Resolution actually supersedes later UN resolutions. When the UN General Assembly divided the country in 1947, it exceeded its authority and jurisdiction. The doctrine in international law states, once you recognize a certain situation, the matter is executed. You cannot change it.
It is a legal document. Now people are ignoring it. So I'm telling them, read the history, learn the legal right of the Jews to the land, and understand that beside the biblical rights, we have also historical and international law rights. Go back and see how many nations were created after the decision of the League of Nations. You cannot have double standards to the Israelis or to the Jews and to other nations that were created by the League of Nations to approve it. You have to follow the international law. We want people to treat us like every other nation.
On July 24, 1922, the League of Nations formalized the Palestine Mandate. It specifically referred to the historical connections of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the moral validity of reconstituting their national home in that country. The term reconstituting shows recognition of the fact that Palestine had been the Jews' home.
The Islamic claim to the land of Israel is far more tenuous, to say the least, in that, first of all, in the Quran, nowhere is it mentioned Jerusalem. There is a chapter in the Quran, albeit with a lot of errors. And there it says, enter my holy people and inherit the land that God gives you. So while there is no Quranic source for giving any of the land of Israel to the Arabs, there is a direct citation in the Quran itself for giving the land of Israel to the Jewish people.
As international legal decisions were moving forward, Jew hatred in the Middle East grew intense and exploded in murderous riots. When the Arabs demanded that Britain rescind the Balfour Declaration, Winston Churchill replied in his 1922 White Paper, "The declaration still stands." However, to appease the Arabs, he decided to redraw the borders of the Jews' promised homeland.
In order that this community should have the best prospect of free development and provide a full opportunity for the Jewish people to display its capacities, it is essential that it should know that it is in Palestine as of right and not on sufferance. That is the reason why it is necessary that the existence of a Jewish national home in Palestine should be internationally guaranteed, and that it should be formally recognized to rest upon ancient historic connection.
The resolution for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
On November 29, 1947, the United Nations adopted a resolution recommending the adoption and implementation of a partition plan for Palestine titled Resolution 181. The vote? 33-13 in favor of the plan. After the termination of the Palestine Mandate and the British withdrawal, the plan would create independent Arab and Jewish states and a special international regime for the city of Jerusalem. The plan was accepted by the Jewish community, but rejected by Arab governments. Civil war broke out in Palestine, and the partition plan was never implemented.
The Jewish people in Palestine who believe in and have been working toward this national state have become an immensely proud and determined people. On the other hand, the Arabs say, we shall bring Muslim brigades from Pakistan. We shall lead a religious crusade for all loyal followers of Muhammad. We shall crush forever the invader. Whether it takes 3 months, 3 years, or 30, we will carry on the fight. Palestine will be Arab. We shall accept no compromise.
His strong support of Israel would later prove to be fatal. June 6, 1968, on the first anniversary of the Six-Day War, Palestinian Sirhan Sirhan assassinates Robert F. Kennedy. Having agreed to receive this tiny piece of land for the new state, Israel declared her independence on May 14, 1948. As the Jewish people celebrated in the streets, 5 Arab nations invaded, vowing to destroy the embryonic state. Against overwhelming odds, tiny Israel miraculously defeated the combined forces of Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. In the bloody war for independence, 4,000 Jews lost their lives. The ceasefire agreement gave Jordan the areas of Judea and Samaria, plus East Jerusalem. Egypt took Gaza. They were able to do this because there was no Palestinian people or Palestinian state. The only rulers over Palestine for the previous 500 years were the Ottoman Turks and the British. The Kingdom of Transjordan tried to annex their conquered land west of the Jordan River and went so far as to change the country's name to Jordan. The prefix trans was dropped as a way to hide the fact that they only belonged on the east side of the river. During the 19 years of Jordanian occupation of the West Bank, not one move was made to establish a Palestinian state there. On the contrary, the PLO was founded during that period with the stated goal of ridding the rest of the land of the Jewish state.
Brilliant strategy move to win the hearts and minds of the West and remove the support from Israel. We have to reorient the conflict from mighty Arab world to little Israel to mighty Israel to the small persecuted Arab people, but we can't call them Arab people because so they invented this term. The Palestine Liberation Organization was created in 1964, Ahmed Suqeri, and the goal was to reorient the conflict and change history.
You know, perception becomes reality. The Arabs have been very skilled at floating this idea of Palestinian statehood being their cause. It's given the West something to believe in. Because, you know, you have to, when you look at if you look objectively at what's happening in the Middle East, you look at the map, you see how Israel is outnumbered, how it's outmanned, outgunned. It's a tiny speck on the globe. You need a microscope to find it. When you look at those things, it's very hard to deny that Israel is a victim. But when you have this counter propaganda effort which is saying that, well, it's the Palestinians who are the victims, you know, they've been denied a state, it gives people who want to be deceived something to hang on to. And I think that's part of the self-deception process that goes on, particularly in Europe, where, you know, I think some of the leaders have no moral backbone whatsoever.
Jordan's occupation and annexation of their West Bank was not recognized by the international community nor the Arab League. Thus, the term West Bank only came about as a result of Jordan's effort to expand its borders. Before the Jordanian invasion, maps published throughout history called the area Judea and Samaria.
The West Bank, the last time it was part of a real state, it was the Ottoman Empire. It has been either in uncertain status as part of the Palestinian Mandate operated by Britain. It's not as if there were a Palestinian state there that Israel had conquered in an aggressive war. Israel's wars have all been defensive anyway. They keep having to fight because they get attacked. what happened in 48, it's what happened in 67, it's what happened in 73, and each time they were attacked, they won. And ended up, particularly after the 67 war, with some increased territory.
What occupied territories? If you mean Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, they are liberated territories. They are part, an integral part of the land of Israel.
From the time of 1967 until now, Jews have begun to live in what we consider our biblical homeland. Any Jew, rabbi or other, who uses the term West Bank is using the terminology of our enemies. The land is called Judea Samaria. It is the biblical homeland. Abraham never walked the streets of Tel Aviv, but he certainly walked the streets of Hebron.
With only 43 miles from the Jordan River to the coast in Tel Aviv, and Samaria taking up 34 miles of that expanse, Israel would only be 9.5 miles wide without it. From a topographical map, the strategic importance of the mountain ridge in this region is clear. Undeniably, Judea and Samaria are Israel's backbone. On May 11, 1949, the UN voted to admit Israel to membership in the United Nations.
Since 1948, Arab leaders have approached the Palestinian problem with an irresponsible manner. They have used the Palestinian people for selfish political purposes. This is ridiculous, and I could say, even criminal.
The Palestinians, who are arguably history's greatest losers, are being used cynically by the Arab world, who could care less about them, to morally beat Israel and to refocus the conflict. It's obvious, it's such a no-brainer that it's never been about creating a Palestinian state. It's always been about the Arab world's inability to accept a Jewish state of any size.
The reason the Arab-Israeli conflict has not been solved is very simple. The Palestinians don't want a state. They want a one-state solution. They don't want a two-state solution. They want the Jews out. All these people who bang on Israel all the time, you know, wow, stop the settlements, do this, do that, all the rest, so we can have a two-state solution. Wait a minute, the other guys don't want one.
On May 27, 1967, Egyptian President Nasser stated the basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight. In an act of war, Egypt blockaded Israel's entrance to the Red Sea and staged for a massive military invasion. Israel struck back, chasing the Egyptians out of Gaza and the Jordanians out of Judea Samaria. They also won the Golan Heights from the Syrians, all in just 6 days, an incredible miracle. The Arab nations had no choice but to sign ceasefire agreements, but they emphasized that they were not recognizing any borders of any kind with Israel, since they did not accept the existence of a Jewish state.
Many of the Arabs claim, and many of the Arab Muslims claim, this land because of a principle in Islam that says that any land that is controlled by Islam or Muslims must one day return to Islam and Muslims. And that's underlying much of the nationalistic arguments about the Palestinian claim to the land of Israel is really an Islamic claim to the land, that one day they would reclaim this land. And that's really what many of the Muslims are trying to get with Spain, with Europe. They're trying to reclaim what they had captured one time before.
On November 22, 1967, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 242, establishing the principles that were to guide the negotiations for an Arab-Israeli peace settlement. Some people wrongly interpret it to mean that Israel is required to withdraw from all the territories it captured. However, the reference clearly applies only to an offensive war.
There is no issue about Israel's legitimate statehood. Israel is entitled to retain territory until there is a peace, because the territory was used as a launching point, and international law on this is pretty clear. If territory is used by one country to attack another, or by a group to attack another, the attacked party has the right to hold on to that territory until there is a
peace agreement.
International law makes a clear distinction between defensive wars and wars of aggression. If a country attacks another and the defender repels the attack and acquires territory in the process, the defender is not required to return the land won. Otherwise, aggressors would have little to lose by attacking their neighbors. In the defensive wars of 1948 and 1967, the Jewish state not only survived, it came into possession of land from which its adversaries launched their attacks.
If you win the war, you keep the land. That is the case everywhere, even in the US. When the US won the war against Mexico, the US is keeping Arizona, New Mexico. So why now, when we won the war and we are now liberated Jerusalem, and today Jerusalem is united, and we liberated Judea and Samaria, why all of a sudden people come to us and say, you must pay the aggressor? No, the Arab nations should know that if they attack Israel and lose the war, they do not get a prize for it. Israel will keep this land.
Although miraculously victorious in 1967, Israel was soon stigmatized as an occupier, and the land won was labeled the Occupied Palestinian Territories, a phrase that shapes the orientation and perspective of literally the entire world. In its truest definition, Occupied Palestinian Territory means Israel is illegally occupying land belonging to someone else. In other words, Israel is flouting international law and has no legitimate right to the land she is occupying. And to many, even Israel proper becomes questionable. Thus, the most severe charge against Israel is a legal one. The whole movement to delegitimize the Jewish state is based on this one accusation that the occupation of the West Bank is an illegal enterprise. If people think you're a thief living on stolen land, then your desire to negotiate for peace has no grounds. This unchallenged narrative has not only undermined the peace process, it has damaged Israel's standing beyond all proportion.
As of today, no one can say that the Palestinians are prepared to accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state. They're clearly not, and they express that in a multitude of ways. They produce maps in which there is no Israel, show the region, but there is no Israel. They continue to talk about Israel even within the uncontested borders as an alien implant that must be destroyed. I don't believe there will be a settlement of any kind, of any lasting kind, until the Palestinians are prepared to accept the existence of the State of Israel.
It's explicit in Hamas's charter. Their objective is not to have a two-state solution with somewhat different borders than Israel wants. When they talk about occupied Palestine, they mean Tel Aviv. They want to destroy the Jewish state.
Time will come, like now, that people say, why you belong here? Who are you to take this land? So that's why the Bible starts, God created the whole world. And he divided the land to the nations. And he gave Israel, the land of Israel, to the people of Israel. Because spiritually, that's where they belong.
Insofar as the legitimacy of the Jewish people to stay connected to its land, which it always has throughout 2,000 years, that is beyond reproach and attack, even though the enemies of Israel insist that, no, today's Jews have no connection back then, or they'll argue theologically, you know, that policy ran out. And when you hear that kind of language, the bell should be going off by saying, this is not someone who's a peace seeker. This is someone who has either swallowed the Kool-Aid or is an activist on behalf of an effort to get rid of the Jewish state.
When you go back to the 1967 borders, you're literally going to divide Jerusalem in half. We can see the city of David behind us. The 67 borders would eliminate the old city the Temple Mount, Christian sites like the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is a very profound time in history right now when the nations of the world are making decisions.
Israel's international birth certificate was validated in many ways. By the promise of the Bible, by the uninterrupted Jewish presence from the time of Joshua to today, by the Balfour Declaration, the San Remo Resolution, and the League of Nations mandate, by the United Nations Partition Resolution and Israel's admission to the UN, by the recognition of Israel by most other states, and, most of all, by the society created through the decades of striving to build a dynamic and national existence. The evidence for Israel is overwhelming, from archaeological science to historical records to biblical scriptures to political resolutions and laws. There should be no dispute as to the rights of the Jewish people to all the land the Roman Empire called Palestine. After over 2,000 years of exile, persecution, and genocide, the rebirth of the Jewish homeland in 1948 was truly an act of God.
The miracle of our age is that after 2,000 years, against all odds, with all the pogroms and with the heinous Holocaust, the Jews came back and reunited with a very small remnant of Jewish people that was here throughout this 2,000 years of exile. And I think the miracle is that it is all authorized and it is all written in the Bible.
When you see a Jewish people who, after 2,000 years of dispersion, has reunited and it's working and it's worked and it's glorious. I'm excited about the opportunities to live in this land when we've done it.
Today, Independence Hall sits quietly, exactly as it was on May 14, 1948, the very room where Israel signed its declaration of statehood, where biblical prophecy became reality.
In that room, you know, where you're sitting there, and I felt the presence of God there. As a Christian, as a believer, I felt His presence because I saw His promise actually manifesting in that location, even though it had taken place decades before I got there. When I came back, to Nashville, my hometown, my whole life had changed, and I had a message to everybody that I could grab, Christian or otherwise, say, listen, you've got to go to Israel.
If we have faith and belief in God as creator of the world and the Bible, then we must also believe in God's covenant with the Jewish people, that He gave the land to them, and only to them. Not to believe in this shows a flaw in our logic, in our faith, and in our belief in God Himself. The recorded history of Israel that spans thousands of years, the many years of dispersal of the Jewish people, and now the return to the land, that is undeniably a miracle of God. And now it is clear that the solution to the puzzle of the elusive peace in the Middle East is Israel indivisible.
I am not embarrassed. I talk about miracles. I am a miracle. This whole story is a miracle. The Jewish history is a miracle. Makes no sense. There is somebody who is watching over us, who wants the Jewish people to succeed and to become light to the nations.
The founder of Israel said that in our time, if somebody does not believe in miracles, he is not realistic. Reality is miracle here. We cannot judge this situation always in logic, because something very special is happening here.